tested her love with lies and deception, but when his real identity was exposed, the betrayal threatened to destroy them both. The morning light spilled in through the tall windows of Brew and Bean, draping the cafe in warm, golden hues that softened the edges of the day. The place smelled of freshly ground beans and warm pastries, the low hum of conversation blending with the hiss of the espresso machine. It was the kind of cozy corner cafe where regulars knew one another's orders, where stories began without anyone noticing until they were already halfway written. Jasmine Rivera hurried through the glass door, her blazer slightly wrinkled from rushing, her dark hair swept into a messy bun that betrayed her late start. She glanced at her phone for the third time in as many minutes, anxiety gnawing at her stomach. In less than an hour, she would be standing in front of executives presenting the marketing campaign she had labored over for weeks. The pressure weighed on her, but the familiar smell of coffee and the reassuring smile of Marcus, the barista, steadied her nerves. "The usual, Jasmine?" Marcus asked, already reaching for the cup. She gave him a quick nod, grateful for his consistency when everything else in her morning felt off balance. Her mind was busy rehearsing slides, anticipating questions, and juggling the endless calculations of what success or failure might mean for her career. Yet as she waited, her attention snagged on something, or rather someone, across the room. In the corner by the window sat a man hunched over an old laptop, fingers flying across the keys only to stop in sudden frustration. He let out a low groan, raking his hands through sandy brown hair as though trying to pull the problem straight out of his head. His clothes were plain, a faded sweater and jeans that didn't draw attention, yet there was a certain intensity about him that set him apart from the other patrons scrolling casually on their phones or chatting in pairs. Jasmine tilted her head, curiosity piqued despite herself. There was something about his frustration, the way his shoulders slumped with defeat, that tugged at her instinct to help. She knew she should take her coffee and run. She didn't have time for distractions, not today, but something in her resisted leaving him there alone in his silent battle. "Here you go," Marcus said, sliding her steaming cup toward her. She smiled distractedly and started for the door, only to pause when the man let out another sound of defeat. It was quiet, but filled with enough frustration that she couldn't ignore it. Before she could stop herself, she crossed the cafe. "Excuse me," she said gently, standing near his table. "You seem to be having some trouble. Maybe I could help?" He looked up sharply, surprise flashing in his blue eyes. For a moment, he simply blinked, as if startled someone had noticed him at all. His gaze met hers, and Jasmine felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite place, depth, maybe even loneliness, buried beneath his guarded expression. "Oh, thank you, but you look like you're in a hurry," he said. His voice was low, almost hesitant, as though unaccustomed to kindness from strangers. "I have a few minutes," Jasmine replied, pulling out the chair across from him before he could protest further. "What are you working on?" He hesitated, his fingers lingering on the keyboard before he said, "I'm a freelance developer. I've been trying to finish a project for a client, but the code keeps crashing. I've been staring at it for 3 hours and can't figure out what's wrong." Jasmine leaned closer, curiosity overcoming any hesitation. "Mind if I take a look? Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes helps." Her confidence was casual, but her eyes were sharp as they scanned the lines of code. Within moments, her fingers began tapping at the keys, correcting small errors with the ease of someone who understood structure and flow instinctively. "Here," she said after a few minutes, "try running it now. You had a syntax error on line 47 and were calling a variable that didn't exist." The man's eyes widened as the program executed smoothly. He looked at her as though she had just performed a small miracle. "That's incredible. You fixed what I couldn't after hours of trying." Jasmine shrugged, sipping her coffee. "It's not a big deal. Logic is logic, whether it's code or marketing strategy. You just have to see where things break down." He stared at her, still processing, then extended his hand across the table. "Alexander," he said, "and I owe you a huge thank you." "Jasmine," she replied, shaking his hand briefly, "and you don't owe me anything. Everyone needs help sometimes." As she stood to leave, Alexander felt a pang of panic rise unexpectedly in his chest. The encounter had been short, yet more genuine than anything he'd experienced in months. He found himself blurting out, "Wait, maybe I could buy you dinner sometime as a thank you?" Jasmine paused, searching his face. There was something disarmingly earnest in his expression, but she smiled faintly. "I'm busy with work, but maybe I'll see you around here again." Her words left the door open, and with that, she was gone. Alexander sat back, cheeks staring at the corrected code on his screen, his heart unsettled. His carefully constructed disguise had been designed to shield him from opportunists, to test whether kindness still existed. Yet this stranger had sat down with no expectation, no ulterior motive, just a willingness to help. For the first time in a long while, Alexander Stone, millionaire, CEO, and man who trusted no one, felt the possibility of something real stirring. What he didn't know was that his test had just begun, and the woman who had captured his attention so easily would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about love. The next morning dawned brighter than usual, the Miami sun cutting through the humid air with relentless energy. Alexander Stone was already awake long before the city stirred, standing at the edge of his penthouse balcony with a cup of untouched coffee cooling in his hand. From this height, the skyline glittered like a promise, his empire sprawled out beneath him. Towers his company had built, contracts he had signed, a city that bore his fingerprints. And yet despite all of it, he felt hollow. His assistant David Park had called late the night before. "Sir, how long do you plan to keep this double life going?" David had asked cautiously. Alexander's silence was answer enough. He couldn't explain, not even to David, how one woman's brief kindness in a coffee shop had rattled him to the core. By the time Jasmine pushed open the door to Brew and Bean, Alexander was already seated at the corner table where they had first spoken. He looked up from his laptop, and when his eyes met hers, something softened in his chest. She hadn't promised to come back, but here she was, clutching her coffee and scanning the room until her gaze landed on him. "You again," she said with a faint, teasing smile as she slid into the chair across from him. "Still wrestling with that project?" "Not today," Alexander replied quickly, trying to sound casual. "Thanks to you, it's running smoothly." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "I'm glad I could help. So, what are you working on now?" The question caught him. He had prepared lies for questions like this, a neatly constructed story about freelance clients and deadlines. But as he looked into her steady, curious eyes, the rehearsed lines stuck in his throat. "Just something new," he said, keeping it vague, feeling oddly exposed. What Alexander didn't admit was that he wasn't there for the work at all. He was there for her. The woman who had, in 10 minutes, treated him more kindly than people who had known him for years. Their conversation began to stretch beyond casual banter. Jasmine spoke animatedly about her latest marketing campaign, how she wanted to create messages that connected businesses to people in genuine ways. "Most companies just chase numbers," she said, her eyes shining with passion. "But I think real impact comes when you understand people, what they need, what they dream about. That's what makes the difference." Alexander leaned forward, captivated. Her words cut deeper than she knew. All his life he had built companies, signed deals, scaled heights most people could only imagine. Yet here was this woman speaking about human connection as though it were the rarest treasure in the world. For him, it was. But as the mine. Newts ticked by, guilt seeped into his chest like poison. He was lying to her with every passing second. She thought he was a struggling freelancer with overdue rent and unreliable clients. She had no idea that he was the man whose name dominated Forbes lists and magazine covers. When Jasmine glanced at the time, she sighed. "I should go. Big meeting today, but..." She hesitated, surprising even herself. "Same time tomorrow?" Alexander's lips curved into something that felt dangerously close to hope. "I'll be here." That night, as the city lights blinked outside his windows, Alexander sat with his grandfather, Robert Stone, who listened with the quiet patience of a man who had seen more storms than most. "She helped me," Alexander confessed, his voice unsteady. "Not because of who I am, not because she wanted anything, she just helped. Do you know how rare that is?" Robert regarded him with wise, weathered eyes. "And yet you are lying to her." Alexander's jaw tightened. If she knew the truth, she'd see the money first. They always do. "Or maybe," Robert said gently, "you are too afraid to believe someone might see you first." The words haunted Alexander long into the night. The following week, Jasmine and Alexander's meetings became routine. She arrived each morning, sometimes exhausted, sometimes bubbling with ideas, but always willing to share her world with him. And Alexander, despite the growing weight of his deception, found himself opening up more than he had in years. He spoke of building things, of wanting to make life easier for others, not lies, but fragments of the truth he kept buried. One morning, as autumn crept into the city and the cafe was quieter than usual, Jasmine studied him carefully. "You look tired today," she said softly. Alexander rubbed his temples, seizing the opportunity his lie provided. "Late night, client trouble, payments delayed. I'm honestly not sure how I'll make rent this month." The words burned as he spoke them, but they were part of his test, a cruel but necessary measure. Would she back away, distance herself from his supposed struggle, or would she stay? Jasmine's brow furrowed, her concern immediate. That's awful. You shouldn't have to deal with clients like that. She leaned forward, her voice firm. I could help you set up profiles on better platforms, or I could connect you with some of my contacts. They're always looking for good developers. Her generosity stunned him. She wasn't just sympathetic, she was ready to act, to put her reputation on the line for him. And Alexander, for the first time since beginning this elaborate charade, felt his chest tighten with something sharp and undeniable. Guilt. Because as she offered him opportunity, hope, and belief, he knew the truth. She was falling for a man who didn't exist. And worse still, he was falling for her. The city pulsed with a rhythm that evening, neon lights reflecting off rain-slicked streets, but Alexander barely noticed as he walked beside Jasmine after dinner at a modest Cuban cafe. The night air was warm, the scent of salt from the nearby ocean mixing with the aroma of roasted coffee beans that lingered on her coat. Their conversations had grown longer, easier, as though they had known each other far longer than weeks. For Jasmine, there was something grounding about Alexander. He listened in a way so few people did, with focus, with care, as if her words weren't just filling silence, but mattered deeply. But for Alexander, every moment with her was both a gift and a torment. He knew he should end the charade before it twisted into something irreparable, yet he couldn't bring himself to let go. Each laugh she shared with him, each glance filled with warmth, tethered him more tightly to the lie he had spun. What began as a test was now a life he didn't want to lose. Do you ever feel like you're carrying the weight of two worlds? Jasmine asked suddenly, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon. The question sliced through him. If only she knew. Every day, he admitted softly. It wasn't the answer of a struggling freelancer, but it was the truth of Alexander Stone, a man living between his billionaire's cage and his yearning for ordinary love. Jasmine didn't press. She simply nodded, slipping her hands into her coat pockets. Me too. They walked in silence, their unspoken truths thickening the air between them, but neither willing to break it. Across the street, a pair of eyes tracked their movements. Grace Williams sat behind the tinted windows of a sleek black car, her manicured fingers tapping against the leather steering wheel. She watched the man who had once been her fiancé, a man she thought she had tethered to her forever through betrayal and secrets. But now there was this woman, this Jasmine Rivera, with her unassuming grace and bright determination. Grace's lips curled into a smile that held no warmth. Alexander had always been naive enough to believe in fairy tales. She would remind him how foolish that belief truly was. Over the next days, Jasmine and Alexander's mornings at Brew and Bean grew into rituals that felt like anchors in both their lives. They shared coffees, stories, dreams. Alexander learned that Jasmine's parents had worked double shifts to give her opportunities she refused to waste. Jasmine discovered that Alexander had a way of speaking about technology and building things that sounded less like a job and more like a calling. She admired his humility, or what she thought was humility. He admired her unshakable drive. But as the connection deepened, so did the stakes. Jasmine's career was on the rise. Her innovative marketing campaign had just been greenlit, and her boss hinted at a promotion. Alexander, meanwhile, played deeper into his role, fabricating new client struggles and financial worries. The more Jasmine encouraged him, the more he felt like a fraud. One evening, as they sat on Miami Beach, the tide whispering against the shore, Jasmine turned to him with a nervous smile. I don't usually say things like this, but I need to be honest. I'm falling for you, Alexander. Her words landed like a thunderclap. For a heartbeat, Alexander couldn't breathe. He had tested her, pushed her, lied to her, and she loved him anyway. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, but the man she believed was struggling to stay afloat. His chest ached with the enormity of it. I love your kindness, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. The way you listen, the way you care. You don't try to impress me, you just make me feel seen. Alexander's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her the truth then and there, to strip away the lies and bare himself fully. But fear shackled him, fear that once she knew, everything between them would shatter. So instead, he cupped her face gently and whispered, I feel the same. And when their lips met under the fading light, it was the most honest lie he had ever told. What they didn't see was Grace once again watching from a distance, her photographer snapping pictures through a long lens. Each flashless shot was a weapon she planned to use. The thought of Alexander finding happiness outside of her control was intolerable. She had ruined his trust before, and she would do it again. The following morning, Alexander woke in his penthouse, the guilt pressing heavier than ever. David called, his voice tight with concern. "She's back, sir. Grace. She's been asking questions about you, about where you spend your time. If she digs far enough, she'll find Jasmine." Alexander clenched his fists, staring out at the Miami skyline. The empire he built had made him untouchable in business, but here, in matters of the heart, he was as fragile as glass. If Grace exposed the truth, Jasmine would never forgive him. The lie that bound them together was also the blade that could cut them apart. And as the days stretched on, Jasmine's love grew deeper, while Grace's shadow loomed closer. For Alexander, time was running out. The test he created to protect his heart was about to become the weapon that destroyed it. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall glass windows of Jasmine's office, painting streaks of gold across the sleek white walls. She was deep into reviewing campaign proposals when her assistant Clara appeared in the doorway, looking unsettled. "There's a woman here to see you," Clara said carefully. "She says it's urgent, about Alexander." Jasmine's head snapped up, confusion etching across her face. "Alexander?" she echoed, setting aside her papers. She hadn't expected him. They weren't supposed to meet until later that evening for dinner. Clara hesitated. She wouldn't give me details, but she seemed very sure you'd want to hear her out. Something uneasy stirred in Jasmine's chest. "Send her in. What's up?" Later, the conference room door opened, and in walked Grace Williams. She carried herself like someone who had already won the game, her platinum blonde hair smoothed to perfection. Her designer suit hugging her figure with ruthless elegance. Her eyes, cold and sharp, locked on Jasmine with predatory calculation. "Miss Rivera," Grace said smoothly, extending a manicured hand, "we need to talk." Jasmine shook it, her instincts bristling. She led Grace to the private conference table, every step feeling like it carried a warning. Grace sat with practiced poise, sliding a tablet across the table as though she were presenting evidence at a trial. The screen lit up with images, magazine covers, business articles, candid shots of Alexander in expensive suits. There he was speaking at tech conferences, shaking hands with politicians, photographed stepping out of sleek black cars. Headlines blared his name, Alexander Stone, tech titan of Miami, the billionaire visionary behind Stone Technologies. Jasmine stared, her pulse hammering in her ears. The man she knew, the man in the worn sweaters, the man who claimed to worry about rent and client payments, was staring back at her from glossy spreads as a multi-millionaire CEO. "This is impossible," she whispered, though even as the words left her lips, pieces began snapping together. His uncanny insight into business, his polished way of speaking about innovation, his quiet avoidance of social events. The hints had always been there, but she had never thought to question. Grace leaned back, satisfaction curling her lips. "It's not only possible, Miss Rivera, it's true. The man you think is a struggling freelancer is one of the wealthiest men in Florida." The words hit Jasmine like a knife. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her mind reeling. "I'm his ex-fiancée," Grace added, her tone cool, devoid of warmth. "Believe me, I know his games better than anyone. He creates false identities to test women, to see if they love him for himself or his fortune. He tested me too. The difference is, I discovered he's read his game before he could humiliate me." Jasmine's breath caught. Her chair scraped against the polished floor as she pushed back. 2 months, she said, her voice quiet but sharp. 2 months of lies. Grace's eyes glinted with victory. "I thought you deserved to know before you made a bigger fool of yourself." When Grace swept out of the room, the silence left behind was crushing. Jasmine sank into the chair, the images on the tablet still blazing like fire. Rage, humiliation, heartbreak, all twisted together inside her chest. Every conversation, every tender moment, every confession, all of it had been tainted by deception. Her phone buzzed. A message from Alexander lit up the screen. "Dinner tonight? Can't wait to see you." Jasmine's hand shook as she typed a single word back. "Cancelled." That evening, Alexander arrived at her apartment anyway. Something in her clipped text had unsettled him, and he needed to see her face. David had warned him Grace was circling, and dread pooled in his gut. It was Nina, Jasmine's roommate, who opened the door, her expression cold. "She knows," Nina said simply. "Grace Williams came today." The blood drained from Alexander's face. "I need to explain," he started desperately. "You need to leave," Nina shot back, but Jasmine's voice came from behind her. "No, let him in. He owes me an explanation." Alexander stepped into the apartment that had become sacred to him, his heart hammering. Every photo on the wall, every small decoration, every scrap of Jasmine's world felt like a home he might never see again. "Is it true?" Jasmine asked, her voice cutting straight through him. Her eyes were red from crying, but her spine was straight, her chin lifted. "Yes," Alexander admitted, his throat tight. "I am Alexander Stone." Jasmine laughed bitterly, tears streaking her face. "The billionaire CEO. And what was I? Your experiment? Your test subject?" "It wasn't like that," Alexander pleaded. "At first, yes, it was a test, but it became real. Everything else between us was real." "Real?" she snapped. "Was it real when I worried about you paying rent? When I introduced you to my contacts? When I believed in you, defended you? All while you sat there, letting me pour myself into lies?" He stepped forward, desperate. "I never asked for your help. You offered it because you're kind, generous. Exactly what I needed to see. And I fell in love with you, Jasmine. The real you. I swear, my feelings are true." Jasmine shook her head, fresh tears spilling. "You don't get it. Do you know what people will say now? They'll say I used you, that I slept my way to success. You've destroyed my credibility, everything I've worked for." Her voice cracked, the anguish in it tearing Alexander apart. He wanted to promise he would fix it, shield her, fight for her, but he knew she was right. His deception had put her in an impossible position. "What can I do?" he begged, his voice raw. "You can leave," Jasmine whispered, her body trembling. "You can let me rebuild my life without you." The silence that followed was unbearable. Alexander felt his world collapse as he turned toward the door, leaving behind the only woman who had ever loved him for who he was. Not his money, not his empire, but he was beneath it all. And watching from her car parked down the block, Grace Williams smiled. The first cracks in their love had appeared, and she would make sure the entire foundation crumbled. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and hollow days. For Jasmine, everything seemed to unravel at once. Her work, once the safe place where she poured all her energy, felt poisoned by whispers. Colleagues glanced at her with pity or suspicion, their smiles brittle, their voices lowering when she passed. She knew exactly what they were saying behind closed doors. She was never promoted for her talent. She caught herself a billionaire. The irony burned. The very thing she had fought to prove, that her achievements were her own, was now stained by Alexander's secret. Every presentation she gave, every late-night hour she spent perfecting campaigns, felt overshadowed by his wealth, a shadow she had never asked to stand under. At home, Nina tried to comfort her. "You didn't do anything wrong," Nina reminded her again and again. "He lied to you. He should be the one humiliated, not you." But Jasmine couldn't shake the image of his face the night he confessed. Haunted, broken, desperate to be believed. Anger and betrayal still burned hot. But beneath them, a quieter ache lingered. She had loved him. And in spite of everything, part of her still did. Across the city, Alexander was unraveling too. He had buried himself in work, his calendar filled with back-to-back meetings, strategy sessions, and business dinners. Deals were signed, profits soared, but the victories rang hollow. At night, when the world quieted and his penthouse windows reflected his solitary figure back at him, he felt the crushing weight of what he had lost. David Park tried to intervene. "Sir, this isn't sustainable. You're working yourself into the ground." "I deserve it," Alexander muttered, staring at spreadsheets he wasn't even reading. "I built an empire, David, but I destroyed the only thing that mattered. This is all I deserve now." David hesitated, then added softly, "Grace Williams hasn't disappeared, you know. She's been busy. People are talking." Alexander's head snapped up. "Busy how?" David slid a folder across the desk. Inside were clippings, screenshots of social media accounts, and whispers from the industry. Grace had been planting seeds. Anonymous posts questioning Jasmine's integrity. Blog articles hinting at scandal. Whispers that Alexander had funded her rise. It was a smear campaign, subtle but effective. "She's trying to destroy her," David said grimly. A fury Alexander hadn't felt in years ignited inside him. Grace hadn't just ruined his relationship. She was trying to obliterate Jasmine's career, her name, her dignity. The thought of Jasmine suffering because of his mistake was unbearable. Meanwhile, Jasmine found herself approached by a journalist named Sophie Turner, who requested a meeting at a quiet cafe. Sophie was known for her investigative pieces on corporate corruption, and Jasmine was wary. "I'm not interested in talking about my personal life," Jasmine said firmly as they sat down. Sophie leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "I don't need you to talk about it. I need you to listen. Grace Williams has been targeting you, not just you, every woman Alexander has ever cared about. Jasmine froze. Sophie pulled out a folder of her own, much like the one David had shown Alexander. Inside were years of evidence, fake social media accounts traced back to Grace, payments made to gossip bloggers, whispers planted in the business community. She sabotages his relationships to keep him isolated and under her shadow. What happened to you? It wasn't just his lie, it was her design. The revelation left Jasmine reeling. Anger flared, but so did doubt. If Grace had orchestrated the cruel reveal, had she also twisted the knife deeper than it needed to go? Was Alexander's deception unforgivable? Or had she judged him too quickly? Blinded by Grace's manipulation? That night, Jasmine walked the streets of Miami, her thoughts a storm. She remembered Alexander's kindness, his gentleness, the way he had listened to her when no one else did. She remembered his confession, not the words, but the desperation in his eyes. And she remembered her father's voice, steady and wise at their last family dinner. Mija, sometimes people hide themselves not because they want to deceive, but because they're afraid to be seen. In his penthouse across the city, Alexander stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, gripping the phone in his hand. He had Robert Stone on the line. "Grandpa, I've ruined everything," Alexander admitted, his voice breaking. Robert's voice was steady, filled with quiet strength. "You haven't ruined everything, Alex. You've made mistakes. But there's a difference. Mistakes can be mended if you're brave enough to face them." Alexander closed his eyes. "She'll never forgive me." Robert paused, then said, "She might. But only if you stop testing, stop hiding, and finally give her the truth. All of it." The old man's words rang in Alexander's chest like a bell. For the first time in weeks, he felt something flicker. Not hope, not yet, but resolve. And as Jasmine lay awake in her apartment, staring at the ceiling, she whispered into the dark, was it ever really about the money, or was it about the lie? Both of them, separate and sleepless, were circling the same truth. The storm that had torn them apart wasn't finished. Grace's schemes were unraveling, but so too were their defenses. The next morning, Brew and Bean would no longer be just a coffee shop. It would become the battlefield where love, betrayal, and redemption would collide. The morning rush at Brew and Bean carried on as usual. Baristas shouting orders, cups clattering against saucers, the faint hiss of steam. To the regulars, it was an ordinary day. But for Alexander Stone, seated once more in the same corner table where everything began, it felt like a reckoning. His suit was simpler than the tailored pieces he normally wore, his hair slightly tousled, his eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. He wasn't here as a billionaire or a CEO. He was here as a man who had lied and lost the woman he loved. The door chimed, and Jasmine Rivera stepped inside. For weeks, he had imagined this moment, imagined her walking back into his life, imagined her fury, her silence, or perhaps, by some miracle, her forgiveness. She wore no armor today, just a navy blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled back neatly, but her eyes burned with determination. She crossed the cafe with steady steps and sat opposite him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The noise of the shop swelled around them, but their silence carved a private world between them. "I know about Grace," Jasmine said finally, her voice sharp but steady. Alexander's chest tightened. "Sophie Turner reached you?" "Yes," Jasmine replied, her gaze unflinching. "She showed me everything. The fake accounts, the bribes, the way Grace has been sabotaging every relationship you've tried to build." Her jaw clenched. "She weaponized your lie to hurt me, to humiliate me." Alexander's fists curled against the table. "I never wanted you to find out like that. Jasmine, I was wrong. Wrong to hide, wrong to test you. I thought I was protecting myself, but all I did was destroy the best thing that's ever happened to me." Her eyes shimmered with restrained anger. "You thought love was something you could measure with lies. Do you have any idea what that did to me? How it felt to find out I was part of some experiment?" The words struck him like a blade. He and forward, desperation in his voice. "It wasn't an experiment anymore. That first morning when you sat down and helped me without expecting anything, do you know how long it had been since someone treated me like a human being instead of a headline? You didn't see a billionaire. You didn't want my money, my status, my power. You saw me. That's what I was desperate to hold on to. And then I was too much of a coward to tell you the truth." Jasmine's hands trembled slightly around her coffee cup. The rawness in his words chipped away at the fortress she had built around her heart. But still, the wound was deep. "You broke my trust, Alexander. And without trust, love doesn't survive. I know, he whispered. That's why I'm here. No more masks, no more lies. If we have anything left, it has to be built on truth. For the first time, Alexander spoke of everything, his rise, his mistakes, his loneliness. He told her about Robert's warnings, David's worries, and the crushing fear that every smile, every kiss he'd ever received had been bought, not earned. His voice broke as he admitted the truth he had never dared say aloud. I was terrified that if you knew who I really was, you'd never believe I could be enough. Not as a man, not as Alexander, without the stone technology's empire behind me. Jasmine listened, her anger softening, her expression torn between pain and compassion. She thought of her father's words. Sometimes people hide themselves not because they want to deceive, but because they're afraid to be seen. Her voice when it came was quiet but firm. You should have trusted me. I fell in love with you long before I knew your name. With the man who listened to me, who cared about my dreams. The lie nearly destroyed that. But Alexander, she drew in a shaky breath. I don't want to let Grace be the one who wins. She doesn't get to decide who we are. Hope flick aired across his face, fragile and radiant. Does that mean? It means, she interrupted, her tone steady. If we start over, it's on my terms. No more secrets, no more tests. If you lie to me again, it's over. Forever. Alexander reached across the table, his hand trembling as it found hers. Complete truth, he vowed, his voice raw. For the rest of my life, Jasmine Rivera, I love you, not because you passed some test, not because you believed in me when I pretended to struggle. I love you because you are strong, compassionate, brilliant, and because you saw a man worth saving when he couldn't see it himself. Tears slipped down Jasmine's cheeks, but this time they weren't just from pain. She squeezed his hand, her heart thundering. I love you too, but don't make me regret this. At that moment, the cafe faded away. The chatter, the clinking of mugs, the hum of the espresso machine, all of it blurred into background noise. What mattered was the fragile, rebuilt bridge between them. 6 months later, the flash of cameras filled the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel. Journalists jostled for angles, society pages hungry for a glimpse of Miami's golden couple. Jasmine stood tall in an elegant gown, her arm linked with Alexander's as they prepared to step onto the red carpet. But tonight wasn't about his wealth. It wasn't even about their status. It was about the truth they had chosen to stand on together. Her career had blossomed, her reputation intact, built on her talent, not his fortune. And beside her, Alexander no longer needed disguises. He had found the one person who loved him without them. As they walked into the glare of cameras, Jasmine leaned close and whispered, "No more tests, just us." Alexander smiled, his eyes shining with gratitude. Just us. And for the first time, their love wasn't hidden or tested or fragile. It was real, honest, and unshakable. The test had ended. The love had just begun.